Two Guys in the Dark.
It happened in early 2000 when I was working at a juvenile detention center in a small town in Oklahoma as a corrections officer. I was working nights at the time, went to work at 9 p.m. This one night when I arrived for work, my supervisor looked confused and asked me what I was doing there. I told him that I worked tonight. He said, "But they said that you called in a few hours ago saying that you were sick." I was a bit confused and said, "It might have been someone else, and they got the message wrong." After everyone else showed up for work that night, it was a bit weirder. We carried on as usual, assigned everyone their places for the night. I went to work in the control room where I usually work. The control room is the center of the prison that has direct control over the cameras, doors, phones, and everything. After I relieved the guard on duty and settled in for the night, I looked at the message that said that I called in. It said that I had called at 6:50 and said that I had gotten sick while out cleaning up after the storm. There had been a storm the night before, and it was a bit bad, but nothing that I had to go out to clean up. It was truly weird. The supervisor came into the control room about that time. He was also a friend of mine outside of work. We started talking about it and how odd it was. I decided to call my wife at home and tell her about it while he was still sitting there. I picked up the phone and dialed. After 2 rings, a man picked up the phone and with a raspy voice said hello. I did not know what to say for a few seconds. I looked at the phone to make sure that I dialed the right number, and I had. After a few seconds, the person said hello, once again in the same raspy voice. I said, "Hello? Who is this?" "This is Taylor. Who is this?" the person had said. My head started spinning because my name is Taylor also. I said in almost a scream, "Where is Ann?" He said, "Ann's in bed. Who is this?" I dropped the phone, told my supervisor to ring me out. I had to get home. I took off towards the door. I could hear Dave pick up the phone behind me and say hello, followed soon after by "What the fuck?" rather real loudly. I ran to my car, drove home faster than what was legal. My mind was racing the entire time. I busted through the door, and my wife was sitting there watching TV, and was shocked at me being home. I asked her who was there. She told me that no one has been here. After a rather long talk with my wife, I went to call the prison to tell them what was going on, but the phone was dead. I went back to work, and when I came in, Dave was acting weird, asking me, "How the hell are you doing?" He told me that when I left, he picked up the phone, and the person on the other end sounded just like me. He freaked out and hung up the phone. A minute later, as he could see my car leaving the parking lot, I had called back from home and asked what the fuck was going on. He said that I was a bit irate and said that I was sick, did not feel like playing these games, and was telling him to stop prank calling me, and then hung up. After convincing him that I had no idea what was going on, we all went back to work. Later, I found out that the phone line for my area had been knocked down the night before by the storm. This is absolutely the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. I was performing massage after massage from morning till night in the winter of 2017. One day I worked with this client named Jerry, a lovely and polite 70-year-old man. I noticed his name immediately because Jerry is not a common name where I live. And he has also stood out because he was the only client that I ever had who wanted to talk through the whole session. He told me about his wife and their kids. He told me that his son just graduated from university and that he already had his own business running. He told me he was proud because his son had been severely injured in the army and worked hard to build himself back up. Then he told me that he himself was a retired soldier. I have always been amazed by soldiers, so I was listening to him like a little girl. He finally told me about his cancer of the lungs. He didn't want to have treatment. He had been told that he would die soon. That was 5 years ago, but mysteriously survived without chemo. So we talked about many, very specific details of his life. As he turned on his chest, I also saw a big scar on his back of his shoulder, which he had received during his time in the army. After we were done, He waved at me, left, but my colleague told me there was something weird going on with the way that he looked at me. It was like he already knew me. I didn't think too much of it, but I talked about it to my sister. 2 weeks later, I went to go get my next client. It was Jerry. I started to ask him about some of the off things that we had spoken about, but he thought that it was odd that I knew so much about him. When I asked about his health and his cancer, he was shocked. The more we talked and talked, I realized that we were having the exact same conversation as last time. He was convinced that he had not been there for many years. I remembered his scar on the back of his shoulder, so when he turned over, I checked to see if I was going crazy. But they were there, of course. When he came out of my cabin, one of my old colleagues, who had worked here for about 20 years, was shocked to see him. She told me that he hadn't come to our institute in the last 5 years. So he was like, "You see, I told you." I ran to go check the client's data, and there was no Jerry record for the last 5 years. I was shaking, and I remembered that I had told my sister about him last time. So I texted her to see if she remembered, or if I was going crazy. She did. My other colleague came out from the back, told me the exact same thing as last time. It's weird the way he looked and waved at you. It's like he knew you from somewhere, or that you were dear to him in his heart. I told her that she'd said the exact same thing 2 weeks ago, but she didn't remember any of that. In college, I took a hard news, soft news journalism class where one of the assignments was to write an obituary for one of my grandparents. The professor told us to write it on a deceased grandparent, but if all of our grandparents were still alive, we just had to choose one. In my case, all of my grandparents were still alive. I procrastinated actually doing the assignment until the night before it was due, because it seemed like a morbid assignment, especially since all of my grandparents were still alive. Scrambling for an easy grandparent to write about, I gave my mom a call, asked her for some basic biography information about my maternal grandfather. As we were talking about my grandfather's career, my mom couldn't recall the name of one of the companies that he worked at. She lectured me about waiting until the last minute to write the assignment because it was late. It was around 10:30 p.m., my grandfather's time. However, she said that she would give him a call to see if he was still awake and be able to answer that question once my assignment was due the following morning. When my mom called my grandfather answered the phone in a panic. My grandmother frantically explained that the paramedics had just arrived and were performing CPR on my grandfather because he had stopped breathing and lost consciousness. My mom was able to stay on the phone with my grandmother until they took my grandfather to the hospital, where he was declared dead. In the time my mom and I had been talking on the phone about my grandfather's obituary, he was already dying. His death was entirely unexpected at that, although he was in his 80s. He was the healthiest of my grandparents at the time. We ended up using the obituary that I wrote for that writing assignment as his actual obituary. It still freaks me out when I think about the timing, though. This happened around 1991. It's the middle of the night. I'm standing in my sister's living room, and it must be a full moon, because even though it's around 1 a.m. and the lights are off, I can see clearly. There's a mixing bowl with popcorn kernels in the bottom of the floor in front of the TV, and some rental VHS in a pile nearby. I hear a noise, turn around to see my sister's normally very friendly Labrador retriever looking like Cujo, fangs barred, gnarly. Hackles were raised. Suddenly there's a bright flash of light, and I wake up, like I hit the bed from a great height. I think that was a really weird dream. Eventually I fall back to sleep, and in the morning I call my sister, planning to tell her the story, but she preempts me by telling me about the weird thing that happened in the night. They woke up to the sound of the dog snarling at about 1 a.m. Her husband thought that there was a prowler in the house, got his gun, went to go find the dog. She was standing in the living room, snarling at the middle of the room. He couldn't see anything, so he flipped on the light. No one was there. The dog instantly stopped snarling and walked to her bed like nothing had happened. He checked the property and went back to bed. We talked a bit. I found out that they watched some rental movies, and of course, we had popcorn, Why? My sister is a little woo-woo at times, so I decided not to tell her about my night. She lived about 450 miles away, by the way. I died. I saw it. I lived it. Either it was another world with a version of me that died that I saw, or I'm going crazy. But I know that I died. We had a pep rally in school, and after it was finished, we had to go back to class. Well, my friend and I were not into that, so we wanted to go across the street to Sonic. Across the school, there is not heavy traffic, but if you don't pay attention, you will get hit. Well, I remember walking with him, and he dropped something, so I went across the street first. I just saw a red Tahoe heading right for me, and I got hit. I remember everything. I remember gasping for air. I remember waking up, and then sleeping again. Then nothing. All of a sudden, I was back in the stadium again, and the exact same words came out of the principal's mouth. My friend wanted to go get Sonic, but I was freaking out, was asking him everything. I thought that it had to be a dream, so I went with him just to see what would happen. He dropped his stuff again, and I waited. To my horror, the same red Tahoe showed up. I told him that I'm going back to school. I'm not dying again. I can still see the other version of me on that street, just messed up, not even moving.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.